Welcome to my first musical analysis video. Today we'll be briefly exploring the theme of the Ruby Sea from Final Fantasy XIV, which is featured in 3 tracks: Liquid Flame, the Day theme, Westward Tide, the Night theme, and finally the Open Box, which is the Dungeon theme. Today's transcriptions will be of Liquid Flame, although the analysis should still largely apply to the other 2 tracks as well. Now I know the title of the video is a masterclass in melody, but it will go through the harmony of the piece at some points as well. Let's get started. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, it's important to establish some basic information about the piece. This is helpful because it might already indicate some features of the piece. Some people already find valuable information from the key alone. For example, they might associate a key with a certain emotion. In the famous example of Schubert, he says something along the lines of D minor being the saddest key. This might apply to you if you have synesthesia, but to me, it mostly sounds like pseudoscience. The tempo, however, will definitely give us some important information. The piece is in 128 beats per minute, which puts it firmly in allegro, which originally means cheerfulness and joy. But regardless of that, it definitely means that the piece will sound lively, joyful or not. The time signature is also quite informative. Now, given that you clicked the video, you probably already played this game and know that the piece is from the Ruby Sea. But if you don't, and you heard the track for the first time, there's a possibility that you would associate it with water. The melody, as we'll discuss later on, is already indicative of this. But in media, there is a trope for water-related tracks to use the 3/4 time signature. There's more information about this on the site TV Tropes, where it lists dozens of examples of this. Now it's time for the nitty-gritty. For this piece, I'm going to be dividing the melody into 3 parts, which we'll go through individually. And here's the first part. The melody here features a key motif, a figure where a chord tone on the beat is approached by step. For the first instance, C# is technically a chord tone of the D major 7 chord, but it still clearly creates tension and release. This motif is used again 3 times, twice of those being inverted. And then here the melody descends by means of arpeggio into the chord change. Contrary to many melody writing tips, this melody features plenty of leaps. Now firstly, disjunct melodies are not necessarily bad. They create a certain feel in your piece, being more energetic and often more tense as well, because the music isn't really settling anywhere. Conjunct melodies, as we'll see later, are more lyrical by nature, and they feel smooth and fluid to the listener. In the setting of water, both of these can work well. So this section could make the listener feel like they're exploring underwater, seeing all sorts of novel things and going to odd places in the area. If we look at the contour, we see that there's a clear high point that is approached and left. So having a clear climax and resolving it is really common in melody writing, because it gives a melody a sense of direction, a goal, and a home. This section, which immediately follows the previous one, is quite contrasting. Much of the piece is formed by this simple 3-note stepwise motion, which occurs 4 times, which is also inverted near the end of the melody. Because this is such a simple figure to develop, it is a really common tactic for composers to start varying the material in other ways, and rhythm is a very obvious choice. So the second occurrence of the motif has a second note delayed by half a beat, and the third appearance is also quite interesting because, unlike the first 2, it's a big leap of a perfect fifth downward. At the same time, you'll also notice that the harmony has changed to a really interesting B flat major 7 chord, and in this key that's the flat 6 chord. This is a popular chord to borrow from the parallel minor key, as it can lead nicely into 5 or even immediately back to 1. But Soken doesn't really do this, and he just slaps in a 2-5-1 afterward. So how does this have to do with the melody? Well, as Adam Neely says, repetition legitimizes. And the pitch and rhythmic material is largely identical in these 4 bars. So because the listener just heard this first 2 bars, these next 2 bars don't really sound bizarre or off-putting, even if the harmony is surprising. It creates an effect where the listener will know that something's telling them that this is unique, but they'll still find the melody to be one cohesive piece. And then for the inversion, it just leads into a cadence. The rhythm is repeated halfway, and the second half is just a dotted half note because it's cadencing. The motion here maintains a constant upward motion, and it does reach a climax here at the G. Even though there's an abrupt leap downward, the overall motion of the melody is still going up, and the melodic contour will still achieve a goal and come back home. Here's the third and final part of the melody. It consists of two lines that kind of mirror each other. So the first 4 bars here are just holding the F sharp, and I guess the most interesting part about this is that the note changes roles as it's held. So it creates tension in the first bar that it appears, serving as the 7th in the G major 7 chord, but in the second bar it almost becomes a chord tone of a cadential 6/4 chord. This is kind of a tangent, but what this is that it's an argument that when a chord that looks like a second inversion of 1 is used, it's actually serving the harmonic function of chord 5, and in this diagram by Justin Rubin, it shows how it functions. The top 2 notes will descend stepwise downward to land on the actual chord tones of 5, and in the example shown it's in C major, so the C and E go down to B and D, and then the G in the bass stays the same. And in this example, the F sharp that's being held, it could be a cadential 6/4 in the key of D. In classical music this is used plenty, so it's arguable that this note has that sort of function. And then it just becomes a chord tone by the end of the tonicization. And you can see the growth of the F sharp. It goes from a tension note to kind of a harmonic note, and then it becomes clearly a chord tone. Now the next part where the melody actually starts moving, the motion mimics the 8th notes from earlier, but it's augmented, which means it's stretched out by a factor of 2, and it's retrograded, which means it's used backward. Then this next bar is trying to go downward and land on this half cadence in B minor. So here the melody is modulated from D major to B minor, through D major as a pivot chord. If we only look at the notes that are on the beat here, there's a stepwise motion descending to the chord tone of C sharp. So as it stands, these notes are kind of boring. So one of the tactics to vary things up is just to put some note, and this F sharp is exactly that. I call this a pseudo escape tone because usually escape tones are followed by a chord tone, but this D is a passing tone, and usually it's not really possible to label every single non-chord tone with an accurate label anyway. And then these 2 notes after are just elaborating the F sharp 7 chord. The next lines start the same, but the latter section serves a function of prolonging this G. This G really wants to go down to the F sharp, and so can find several ways to drag the G out. This F sharp here is a neighbor tone, and this A and F sharp is a neighbor group, and then this E is just a chord tone. Finally, it lands on the F sharp, and then the melody ends. The latter half of the first line shows a melodic contour that clearly goes up and down, with a climax and a home. But the second line is much more static. You could interpret this to be the second line being much more relaxed than the first without too much action, but you could also look at the difference in register here. The first line drops down a 7, and then it barely reaches the upper register that it was at in the first half, choosing to kind of loiter around in the lower register instead. But then the second line maintains the height of the pitch, and that sounds like Soken's way of conveying energy, animation, or even panic. To build energy is one thing, but you can also show a maintained stretch of energy in music. And then in the piece, the section after this one is just these 2 lines but repeated a semitone upward, so I'm not going to repeat the analysis. And then the piece loops back around, which means that the piece has ended. I hope you all learned something from this video, whether it's to write a good melody, how to convey things through your melody, or just learning what choices composers often make in their music. And there will be more videos like this coming out soon, so stay tuned. Thank you for watching.